I wanted to talk to you this morning about someone that you may not know about. Her name was Leonora Eveline Piper. Ever heard of her? Very famous medium from Boston. Leonora was born in 1857. She died in 1950. And when I did my master's work, and she was included, and I found out that she died 2 years after I was born, I thought, boy, she lived in my lifetime. This is recent stuff, you know. But Leonora's mediumship began when she was 8 years old. She was out in the garden, and she felt a stinging blow to her right ear. She felt like something hit her. And after that, she heard a long sibilant S, this long S, and that sibilant S dissolved into the word Sarah. And that word became Aunt Sarah, not dead, with you still. Well, of course, she was frightened to death. She didn't know what had happened. She didn't know what was going on. She told her mother. Her mother made a note of the day and the time. And guess what? You can all probably tell me what had happened. What had Aunt Sarah done? She died right at that specific time. Yes. A few weeks later, Leonora was crying and complaining because she couldn't sleep because of the bright light in her room with all the faces in it. And she said, the bed won't stop rocking. So that was kind of interesting. At the age of 22, she married William Piper of Boston. And soon after she was married, she met a blind clairvoyant doctor. And he was attracting a lot of attention with his medical diagnoses and cures. And she went to meet him for the first time, fell into a short trance, and in that trance state, she walked across the room, sat at a table, and began to write messages. And those messages seemed to come from spirit entities. And she achieved a certain notoriety through the meetings that went on at this particular clairvoyant's home. There was a judge there who claimed that the message that he got from his son was the most remarkable message that he had ever received. Leonora was not happy with all this popularity, and she basically refused to see anyone other than family or intimate friends. But an interesting thing happened. Anyone ever heard of Dr. William James, the author of Varieties of Religious Experience? Dr. James' mother-in-law asked for a sitting with Leonora, which was granted. And her exposure to Mrs. Piper, and also her daughters, who was James' wife, they came home raving about Mrs. Piper. And so Dr. James decided that he had to go see her. And he expected to be able to just debunk her. He was going to go once, and that was going to be it. Didn't quite happen that way. He went to see her once, and his impression of her work and her powers was so strong that he not only continued to see her for months, he continued to see her and investigate her for the next 25 years. Okay? And he wrote of her. Now, he wrote in the 1890 proceedings of the SPR, the American SPR, that's Society for Psychical Research. I repeat what I said before, that taking everything I know of Mrs. Piper into account, the result is to make me feel absolutely certain, as I am of any personal fact in the world, that she knows things in her trances which she cannot possibly have heard in her waking state, and that the definite philosophy of her trances is yet to be found. He also wrote, and this is a very famous quote, if I may employ the language of a professional logic shop, a universal proposition can be made untrue by one particular instance. If you wish to upset the law that all crows are black, you must not seek to show that no crows are black. It is enough to prove that one crow is white. My white crow is Mrs. Piper. In the trances of this medium, I cannot resist the conviction that knowledge appears which she has never gained by the ordinary waking use of her eyes, ears, and wits. What the source of this knowledge may be, I do not know. I have not a glimmer of an explanatory suggestion to make. But from admitting the fact of such knowledge, I cannot escape. I get frustrated with Dr. James every now and then. I think he knows it because he's come through in several seances, and I've had an actual chance to communicate with him. He will walk right up to the door of saying there is survival after death, we are communicating with discarnate entities on the other side, and he'll say, there's just not quite enough information. We call that jokingly James' Law. There's always enough information to convince the believer, but there will never be enough information to convince the skeptic. So that's James' Law. You might want to keep that in mind. He began to do experiments with Mrs. Piper, and of course she, like many mediums, had a control. That control was a French doctor named Finouille, and he gave the impression of being inherited from this clairvoyant blind doctor that she had worked with. He was not Piper's first control. He was preceded by an Indian girl. Now I think the Indian girl's name is funny. Her name was Chlorine. That tickles me. She had Commodore Vanderbilt, she had Longfellow, she had Laurette Pincini, and she had J. Sebastian Bach. Well, that interests me. I want to know about why J. Sebastian Bach came through to her. I'm a musician. So anyway, Finouille claimed to have lived from 1790 to 1860, and when she slipped into trance and when he took control of her, her voice would change into his deep, rough, country-flavored French accent. Her personality would change from a very eager to please, very well-mannered, very cultured lady into a very abrasive, forceful person. James never found any proof that a Dr. Finouille had existed. And you all know that there's been investigation of many mediumistic readings, and we found the people that were referred to had lived. We found their burial places, things like that. We've never found any proof for Dr. Finouille. Also, the interesting fact, Dr. James spoke fluent French, and he would start to address Dr. Finouille in French, and Finouille did not speak very good French. So that was kind of funny. We enjoyed that. He remained her control from 1884 to 1892. In the early days of her trance mediumship, she communicated by voice rather than by writing. And sometimes, as with many mediums going into trance, there are convulsive movements. And once they get there, they don't react to stimuli, like having ammonia or a needle in their hand or things like that. Finouille relied on slang and profanity that was certainly not characteristic of Mrs. Piper. By the end of his time, around 1892, she was communicating more by automatic writing than she was by speech. By the time we get to 1892, there is another control that is taking control. His initials, he is known as GP. Now he is George Pelham or George Pellew. I found both names, both spellings. He was an acquaintance of Richard Hodgson. Now I'm going to jump off of this and go back to something I said yesterday in the workshop. Richard Hodgson was one of those that we referred to on the other side as one of the communicators in the cross-correspondence case. Okay? Pelham was a friend of Richard Hodgson, and he died in an accident. And he began to come through Mrs. Piper. He had attended some of her seances, but he had been introduced under an assumed name, so she didn't know who he was. He was the control from 1892 to 1897. And she became also under the control of a band of what we call high spirits. I always think that's kind of funny because that makes us think maybe she was drinking something interesting. But these spirits had names like Rector and Doctor. The leader of this band of high spirits was somebody named Imperator. And the content shifted away in these readings from evidential communication to very scientific lectures and philosophic lectures. It reminds one of Casey, because early Casey dealt with evidential material and dealt with medical material, and then moved into, all of a sudden we're getting life readings, you know, you were this, and then you were this, and you were this, all that kinds of stuff. So anyway, we had GP. Richard Hodgson also died in 1905, and he liked Mrs. Piper very much. And he said that if he was going to come back, that he would come back through her. Mrs. Piper was taken to England because we were in an era with Dr. James and the SPR here and the SPR in England, where we were testing everybody. So we were checking everybody out. They took Leonora to England, they took Eusapia Palladino to England, they brought Eusapia here. They would take them out of their familiar surroundings to test them and see what they, you know, if they were picking up anything by telepathy. And Mrs. Piper didn't know anything about England. She didn't know anything about English politics. She didn't know anything about English people. And she was taken to Cambridge, and that's where she did her work. And she convinced William James of the reality of ESP, but he was uncertain about survival still. He's the one that we named James Law after. And Frank Podmore, one of the researchers also with the SPR, he wrote about the GP impersonation, the GP control. He said the impersonation, if it were an impersonation, and not the actual GP manifesting itself through Mrs. Piper's organism, was consistently and dramatically sustained. So you have the GP control. William James thought the Hodgson control was so important that he actually wrote a report on Mrs. Piper's Hodgson control and submitted it to the SPR. So there was a lot of information there. Mrs. Piper is important in the history of psychical research for at least 3 reasons. 1, she is the first to provide substantial evidence for the possession of some paranormal faculty. 2, the records of her case are unsurpassed in quality and detail. In fact, if all the papers of the proceedings for the society were collected, they would fill several large volumes, just the papers on her. 3, she is one of the few mediums whose tranche speech and writings have been subjected to serious and extensive psychological analysis. Dr. Hislop was another one of the researchers with the SPR. He attended seances with Mrs. Piper. He wore a black mask that completely covered his face. He would sit behind her while she was going into trance. He did not utter one sound. Despite those kinds of conditions, Mrs. Piper mentioned his name several times. She gave names of so many of his family members that it took him more than 6 months of letter writing to his kin in a small Ohio town to verify all the information that was told to him in that one reading. When Mrs. Piper died in 1950, being a very old lady of 93 years old, the majority of researchers who sat with her were more than willing to agree with William James' statement. I wish to certify here and now the presence of a supernatural knowledge, a knowledge the origin of which cannot be attributed to ordinary sources of information, that is, to our physical senses. As the work with Mrs. Piper went on, it became clear that many of her phenomena could not be explained away in terms of usual suspects. Fraud seemed easy to rule out. Mrs. Piper, again, as I said, was a well-educated, very cultured Bostonian woman. The idea of fraud would just be totally alien to her nature. They also looked at the grapevine theory, saying that she had gained information from a growing network of families for whom she sat there in Boston. But when you take all of that together, there's still a lot that remains unexplained. Frank Podmore concluded this way. He said, Mrs. Piper's trance statements are so numerous and so precise, and the possibility of leakage to Mrs. Piper through normal channels, in many cases so effectually excluded, that it is impossible to doubt that we have here proof of a supernormal agency of some kind, either telepathy by trance intelligence from the sitter of some kind of communication from the dead. So Leonora is extremely important, she's extremely interesting, and she's one of the very early cases that has been thoroughly investigated. And I commend Leonora Piper to you. Thank you.